The desert at night is nothing like the day. In the sun, it's endless and harsh, but under the moon it feels alive, breathing in silence. The clearing I camped in was flat and wide, circled by low brush and jagged rock. My lantern threw a pale ring of light against the sand, but outside that circle, the dark stretched forever. The air was still heavy, and every sound carried farther than it should. The scrape of my boots, the soft zip of the tent, the faint hum in the distance like wires buzzing, though no poles stood for miles. I remember sitting there, staring at the fire as it burned low, the shadows reaching farther across the clearing. My breath slowed, my eyes blurred. For a moment, I thought I saw something lean forward in the dark, thin and sharp, like smoke twisting into a figure. I blinked and it was gone. The desert always plays tricks, I told myself, but then I heard it. A soft shuffle of sand, deliberate, circling closer, though nothing was there when I turned. That feeling of being watched dug deep into my chest, heavier than the night itself. I never should have looked beyond the firelight. The desert was quiet, almost impossibly so. Moonlight spilled across the dunes, soft and pale. The sand looked ordinary at first, but then shapes began to appear. Tall figures, motionless. At first, I thought they were just rocks. But the curves, the shoulders, the subtle bend of what might be arms. No rocks stand that way. I sat on the ridge above my small camp. The wind moved only a little, brushing my hair. Every night I watched them. They didn't move like animals. They didn't leave footprints. But each morning they were closer. I blinked. Maybe it was my eyes playing tricks. But the next night they had shifted again. I tried to count them. 7, maybe 8. Sometimes 9, always standing there, watching the pale sand shimmer beneath the moon. I spoke softly to myself. Nothing back, just the soft rustle of the wind, and then the faintest hum, like sand itself was holding its breath. I wanted to walk toward them. I wanted to see if they would vanish, if my feet would stir the surface beneath them. But something in me, something I couldn't name, held me back. I stayed put. The figures barely changed, yet somehow they were closer than before, closer than the night prior. I smelled the dry cold of the desert, a scent like cracked stone, like dust in my nose. The shadows stretched long. Each dune seemed alive with subtle movement. I wondered if they were aware I was watching, if they were waiting. The moon rose higher, spilling light that made the sand glow like frost. I noticed one figure, slightly taller than the others, its head tilted, almost as if listening, almost as if considering. I could hear the smallest shift of grains against grains, soft, almost imperceptible, the kind of sound that makes your skin tighten without reason. I thought about my own footprints. I had walked these dunes alone, yet my tracks were the only proof of life. No trace of theirs. Not one mark. Not one. I pressed my hands to my knees. The night was still, except for the whisper of my own breathing. And then a pause, longer than the pause of wind. A silence that stretched like the dunes themselves. I shivered. I could feel the emptiness behind me, in the darkness of the desert stretching back to nothing. I turned my head slowly. Nothing moved there. When I looked back at the figures, they were closer, closer than the ridge should allow, closer than the night before. I want to call out. My voice cracked in a chill. The words caught in my throat. I pressed my palm into the sand, grounding myself. It felt ordinary. But when I looked back, one of the figures had moved again, a subtle shift in stance. Nothing dramatic, but enough. I felt a pulse of fear that was almost calm, a slow, deep dread that sank into my chest. The desert seemed endless, and I was small, alone. I tried to sleep in my tent, but even through the thin canvas, I could see them. Even through closed eyes, I felt them, watching, waiting, shifting. By morning, I forced myself to rise. The sun spilled across the dunes, warm and bright. The figures had vanished, or perhaps the daylight made them meaningless. Yet I knew they had not gone far. I would see them again, closer, and I would watch, always, because the desert had its secrets, and I had become part of one. The desert felt different that night. The air was heavier, warmer against my skin. I had followed a faint curve in the dunes and discovered a clearing I hadn't noticed before. It was shallow, circular, and empty, yet it hummed, a low vibration, subtle enough to almost ignore. Almost. I stepped into the center. The sand beneath my boots was soft, shifting slightly, as though it had a memory of something buried beneath. I knelt, letting my fingers sink into it. It pulsed faintly, like the desert itself was breathing under my touch. I closed my eyes. The wind carried the scent of dry roots, of something hidden and old. Every inhale made my chest tighten. I listened. The hum grew, or maybe I had simply tuned in. It vibrated through the soles of my feet, through my legs, through my spine. I wanted to move, to run, but my curiosity held me. Something beneath that sand, something waiting. It wasn't alive in the way I knew, and yet I could feel its attention. A dry rustle sounded behind me. I whipped around. Nothing, just the dunes, long shadows in the moonlight. I stepped closer to the edge of the clearing. The sand shifted beneath my weight. I knelt again. The vibration beneath the surface was stronger now. I felt it in my palms, as though something was pressing up from below. I imagined shapes, small at first, like fingers of sand, then larger, broader. Maybe arms, maybe bodies. A cold shiver ran along my neck. The desert wind whispered through the edges of the hollow. I could almost hear breathing, but there was no one there. I leaned closer, my ear nearly brushing the sand. The hum grew louder. A pulse, a rhythm. I imagined it syncing with my own heartbeat. I stood suddenly. The sudden movement made the sand ripple, and then I saw it, a faint outline just beneath the surface, a shape that seemed to move of its own accord, like the desert was trying to speak. I stepped back, my heart rising in my chest. The vibration followed me, subtle, persistent. It didn't matter how far I moved. The clearing held me. I wanted to call someone, to say that something lived just beneath the sand, but the silence held me. The stillness pressed in, and I realized no voice would answer me here. The moon shifted. Shadows stretched differently now, and in the center of the clearing, the sand appeared darker, deeper, a hollow that didn't belong. I crouched again. I pressed my hand to the cool grains. It trembled faintly beneath my palm, and for a moment, I felt a weight, a presence, something watching from below. I shivered, pulled my hand back. The wind gusted briefly, carrying the scent of something metallic, something buried long ago. I could feel it in my nose, on my tongue. The desert held its breath. I sat on the rim of the clearing. The vibrations under my feet persisted. Slow, steady, waiting. I imagined the sand parting, revealing shapes that had been trapped for decades, or centuries. I thought about leaving. But the hum, the subtle pull, it made me stay. Curiosity had me rooted, even as fear dripped down my spine. Time passed differently there. Minutes stretched into long, quiet stretches. I felt my pulse echo the vibration beneath the surface. The desert itself seemed to hold me in a single, endless moment. Finally, I rose. The moon hung high and pale. The clearing was quiet now, still, but the hum lingered, a low, persistent whisper in the bones of the sand. It didn't stop when I walked away. It followed, faintly in my chest and my steps. I looked back once. The hollow appeared ordinary again, empty, yet I knew. The desert had secrets beneath that sand, secrets that watched and waited, patient, unseen, and I had stepped too close. The desert felt colder that night. The wind was soft, brushing my skin like fingertips. I climbed a small ridge to watch the horizon, and there they were, dark silhouettes, standing atop a distant rise. Tall, still, silent, no movement, except for the faint sway of the wind through the sand around them. I froze. I blinked. Maybe it was my eyes playing tricks. But the ridge didn't lie. I tried to count them. 7, maybe 8, each one unmoving, watching. I thought I was imagining it. But the longer I stared, the more the shape of each figure became clear. Human, but not quite. Their heads tilted just slightly, like they were scanning the desert below. Their hands hung at their sides. Empty. I shifted my feet, trying to hide my presence. The figures didn't move. I stepped left. They remained. I stepped right. They remained. The wind carried the faint scent of stone and dry dust. Every inhale felt heavy, full of static tension. I wanted to run. I wanted to leave. But something held me there. I watched as the moonlight touched their shoulders. Long shadows stretched down the slope. Each one was perfectly still, perfectly deliberate. I thought about approaching, to see if they were real, to see if they would vanish like the sand figures I had watched before. But there was a pause in my chest, a slow tightening. I didn't move. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had no weight here. I heard my own heartbeat, slow and steady. The dry scrape of sand under my boots felt loud. And yet, there was nothing else. I tried to imagine them gone. Closed my eyes. When I opened them, the silhouettes remained. Exactly where they had been. Exactly the same. I noticed one figure slightly ahead of the others. Its head tilted at an impossible angle. And for a brief second, I thought I saw it breathe. But there was no air moving the desert around it. I leaned against a rock, trying to calm myself. The wind moved across the dunes in faint, sighing waves. The cold pressed into my fingers and toes. And still, the watchers did not move. I took a step backward. The ridge seemed to stretch beneath me. Long, empty, endless. I tried to look away, but my gaze kept returning. They were patient, endless. They seemed to know I was there, and yet did not care. I whispered to myself, small words, soft, meaningless. The wind swallowed them. I felt a shiver in the space between my shoulder blades. A faint tickle at the back of my neck. The moon began to fade. Shadows collapsed. And when the first pale light of dawn touched the sand, I blinked. The ridge was empty. I scanned the horizon. No silhouettes. No shadow, no sign. The desert was ordinary again. I stepped closer, my boots scraping against small stones. The sand held only my footprints. No trace of them. No hint they had ever been there. And yet I could still feel them. A lingering presence, like a weight pressing from afar. Something patient, waiting for nightfall again. I thought about the way their shoulders had shifted in the moonlight. The impossible tilt of the head. The long shadows stretching across the dunes. I shivered. Cold, quiet, endless. I walked down the ridge, careful to keep my eyes on the empty horizon. But I knew they would return. When the sun set, when the dunes grew silver in the moonlight, I would see them again, standing, watching, unmoving, the watchers on the ridge. And I would remember the way it felt to be observed, not by eyes I could see, but by something older, patient, relentless. Even now, the memory presses against my chest. A slow, quiet dread, a whisper of wind, a shadow stretching too far. I wonder if I will ever climb that ridge again. If I do, they will be waiting, and I will feel their patience, as if the desert itself is holding its breath for me. The desert was quiet, but not empty. A pale haze floated over the dunes, barely noticeable in the moonlight. I had wandered farther than usual, following the curve of a distant ridge, when I saw it, a fire. It burned in the sand, small at first, but unmistakable. Flames pale blue, flickering softly. It cast long, impossible shadows across the dunes. And yet it gave no warmth. I froze, listening. No crackle, no hiss, only the desert wind, moving gently over the grains. The flames danced silently, throwing shapes across the sand that didn't quite match the fire. I stepped closer. The heat I expected wasn't there. Instead, a cold brush against my skin, brushing like fingertips. The shadows stretched toward me, long and thin. I felt a pull, gentle, insistent. I knelt near the edge of the fire. The sand beneath my hands was cool, ordinary, yet the flames seemed to bend around me, shaping the light in ways I couldn't follow. A tall shadow leaned against a dune. I hadn't noticed it before. I imagined it moving, shifting closer, but it stayed rigid, silent. I heard the faintest hum, soft, melodic, almost like wind through a flute. It rose and fell, keeping pace with some rhythm I couldn't catch. I tried to match my breathing to it. My chest felt tight. My palms tingled against the sand. I glanced up at the horizon. The The dunes were ordinary again, pale in the moonlight, but the shadows, they lingered, twisting, stretching toward the ridge toward me. I wanted to leave. I wanted to step back, to run from something I could not name. But curiosity held me. It wrapped around my ankles like sand, heavier than the ground beneath me. I stared at the flames. The fire danced, pale and strange. No sparks rose. No smoke curled into the sky. And yet, the shadows it cast were alive. They moved independently, twisting over dunes, dipping into hollows, stretching far longer than they should. I whispered to myself, small words, a name, anything. The wind swallowed them. The fire remained. And the shadows followed me with every glance. I touched the sand again. It shifted faintly beneath my fingertips. Shapes seemed to push upward. Nothing solid. Just pressure. Presence. I looked into the flames. For a moment, I thought I saw figures inside, dark and still, watching me, waiting. I blinked. Nothing. The fire remained silent. I stepped around it, careful not to touch the strange, heatless light. The shadows stretched impossibly long. One reached toward me, but when I stepped back, it receded. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. The desert was calm, ordinary, and yet this fire, this strange, silent, cold light, it changed everything. I wondered if I was dreaming, or if the desert had simply opened a space I was not meant to see. The hum under the dunes, the stretching shadows, the unnatural light, all of it pressed against the edges of my mind, subtle, persistent. I stayed until the moon dipped low. The flames didn't falter. The shadows didn't shrink. The cold remained. And then I turned away. Step by slow step, I walked back to my camp. The dunes behind me glowed faintly with the fire's light. Shadows danced across the sand, reaching just beyond my sight. I could feel them following. Not physically, not consciously, but in the quiet pressure against my chest, in the faint tingle of cold down my arms. By the time I reached my tent, the fire was gone, or perhaps it never existed, but the shadows lingered, stretching long across my sleeping bag, across the sand, across my memory. I lay awake for hours. The desert wind whispered, the hum from the dunes faint, almost imperceptible, and the fire, pale blue, burned in my mind, warmthless, silent, unfinished. I know I will return. I know I will find it again, and the shadows will stretch, twisting, waiting, as though the desert itself is alive, and watching. Morning came quietly. The desert stretched pale and still beneath the rising sun. I stepped out of my tent, blinking against the light, and that's when I noticed them. Footprints, circling the tent, fresh, too large to belong to a man, too deliberate to belong to an animal. I crouched and pressed my fingers into sand. Grains sifted through them like powder. Each step was precise, measured, tracing a path I could follow but not understand. I walked the perimeter, careful not to disturb anything. The prints led around my small camp, over the dunes, looping back again. Every morning they were here, always circling. I tried to convince myself it was a wind, or perhaps some animal I had never seen. But the shape, the spacing, the certainty of each print, it was deliberate. The desert wind shifted. A faint hum rose from the dunes, almost imperceptible. I felt it under my boots, in my chest, a vibration that seemed to answer the rhythm of the prints. I stepped closer to the largest one. The sand beneath my fingers trembled slightly, a soft pulse, as though something beneath was aware of my touch. I tried to ignore it. I went about my morning, collecting water from the canteen, brushing sand from my tent. But the footprints, they were there, watching, waiting. I thought about leaving, packing up and walking until the desert swallowed me. But the prints circled, patient, always returning to the same position around the tent. I imagined a creature or presence that made them, tall, deliberate, slow, its feet pressing into the sand, leaving echoes of something I could not name, a shadow behind a shadow. The sun rose higher. Shadows shortened. The prints remained, unchanged by the light. I traced one with my hand. The sand gave under my fingers, soft and dry, but I felt the weight, the shape of what had pressed into it. and I felt it again watching. A faint rustle reached my ears. I spun around. Nothing, just the wind whispering through distant dunes. Yet the feeling lingered, heavy, like the air itself was breathing around me. I pressed my palms to my knees, trying to calm my racing thoughts. The footprints circled endlessly, precise, deliberate, too large to belong to me, too deliberate to belong to anything I could name. I wanted to leave again. I wanted to run. But something held me in place. Curiosity, or perhaps a quiet, growing dread. I sat on the sand, watching the prints. Each morning, I would find them anew. Their presence silent, their pattern inevitable. I felt the desert shift under my skin, each grain of sand whispering secrets I could not hear. Evenings were worse. The sun sank, shadows grew long, and sometimes I thought I saw movement. A faint distortion in the dunes just beyond the prints. A presence bending the sand, careful not to leave more marks. I slept poorly. Every night, the sand seemed alive beneath my tent. Every morning, the prints were waiting. A ritual I could not understand. A visitor who left no trace of themselves beyond the circling feet. I thought of leaving forever. But where would I go? The desert stretches endlessly. And whatever made those footprints, it would find me again. I rose one morning and followed the prints farther than I had before. They led over the dunes, around hollows, skirting the edge of ridges. I kept pace, my heart slow, careful, but the desert itself seemed to bend toward them, guiding, shaping, patient. And then I stopped. The prints ended abruptly, vanished into the sand. No trace of departure. I felt the desert hold its breath, a silence heavier than any night. And I realized the prints had not left. They had waited, waiting for me to notice, waiting for me to follow. And I had. Dusk fell slowly over the desert. The air cooled, carrying the faint scent of dust and distant stone. I sat on a small dune, watching the horizon deepen into violet and black. And then I saw them, a line of figures, moving across the sand. Far off at first, thin shapes stretched against the dim light. No sound came with them. No rustle, no footsteps, no sigh of wind from their passing. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I saw. They moved steadily, rhythmically, as though part of some quiet procession. Shadows stretched long behind them, thin as threads. And when I blinked, they were closer. I wanted to call out. I wanted to ask what they were, but the words died in my throat. There was a hush in the desert that seemed to swallow sound. Even the air felt thicker, heavier, pressing against my skin. I rose slowly, careful not to make a noise. The figures marched onward, straight and unyielding, never staggering, never faltering. Each one identical in motion, each one silent. I noticed their shadows first, long, impossibly thin, stretching far ahead and behind. They moved independently, bending around dunes, dipping into hollows, weaving between rocks without touching. And yet, the figures themselves never wavered. I stepped closer to the edge of my dune. The sand shifted lightly beneath my boots. I half expected the caravan to vanish if I approached, but they didn't. I thought about the desert stillness. Even the wind had paused. The air carried only the faint, metallic scent of sand under moonlight, and the procession moved across it, deliberate, patient. I tried to imagine who, or what they were. Travelers from another time? Ghosts of the dunes? Or something older, waiting, patient? Folding itself into the night? A shadow passed over me. I looked up. One figure had paused, or at least seemed to hesitate, though its motion was imperceptible. Its shadow stretched farther, thinner, reaching toward me in a quiet, impossible gesture. I shivered, cold, dry, creeping along my spine. The desert seemed to lean inward, as though holding its breath for me. I wanted to move. I wanted to turn and run down the dunes. But something, curiosity or fear, rooted me in place. The caravan continued, gliding across the sand. I realized there was no sign of feet, no tracks in the dunes behind them. The sand remained smooth, untouched, as if the desert had swallowed every trace. I pressed my palms against my knees, feeling the warmth drain from my skin. I whispered their rhythm to myself, soft, careful. The motion of their silent passage matched the slow beating of my heart. and still they never faltered. I thought about following. I imagined walking alongside them, step for step, silent, patient, weaving through the dunes. But the thought made my chest tighten. A quiet warning, deep and instinctual. Some things in the desert are not meant to be followed. The last light of dusk faded, leaving a thin silver wash over sand. The figures grew faint in the darkness. Shadows still stretched impossibly, brushing against rocks and dunes, curling into hollows. And then they vanished. No trace remained. No tracks. No sound. The desert returned to its ordinary hush. I stayed on my dune listening. The wind returned, brushing my cheeks and carrying a faint metallic scent. But the silence of the caravan lingered in my mind. A wait, patient, steady, waiting for the night to return. I lay in my tent that night, unable to sleep. The memory of thin shadows stretching across the dunes pressed against my chest. The quiet rhythm of their movement echoed in my ears. Even in dreams, they glided through the sand, never faltering, never seen. I know they will return. When dusk falls again, when the desert breathes in silver and shadow. The silent caravan will move, a procession without sound, without end, and I will watch. Because the desert has its watchers, and sometimes they move through the night in ways we cannot hear. We cannot touch. We cannot stop. The desert night was endless. Stars burned cold above me, sharp and distant. I lay on the sand, staring up, listening to the faint hiss of wind over the dunes. And then I noticed it. A patch of sky, darker than the rest. Not clouds, not shadow, just a black void where stars should be. At first, I thought my eyes were tired, but the darkness stayed. It was impossible. The desert sky is endless every night, yet here a pocket of nothing. I rose slowly, brushing sand from my clothes. The void shifted, imperceptibly at first. Then, like slow water, it began to descend, toward the clearing I had claimed for camp. The air grew still. The faint desert hum, usually comforting, pressed against my chest now. I felt it in my legs, in my fingertips, like the sand itself was vibrating. I wanted to call out. I wanted to run. But the voice caught in my throat, swallowed by silence. I watched as the blackness hovered just above the sand. It didn't move like wind, didn't ripple like heat. It simply existed, pressing down, a weight on the night. I could feel it watching. Not like eyes, not like human thought. Something older, patient, indifferent. I stepped closer to the edge of the clearing. The sand shifted faintly beneath my feet. I imagined pressing my hand into it, seeing what lay beneath. A strange urge, sharp and quiet, told me not to, and yet I stayed. The black shape stretched slowly, widening just above the ground. Shadows from my campfire bent toward it, reaching upward, twisting unnaturally. The fire burned low, pale flames trembling in response. I whispered to myself. The words felt fragile, swallowed immediately by the desert. Even the wind held its breath. I realized I could see nothing inside the darkness. No contours, no flicker, just a void. But I felt it move subtly, like a weight shifting underwater. I shivered. The air felt colder here, though the desert should still hold warmth from the day. The sand beneath my toes prickled, as if crawling with unseen life. I stepped back instinctively. The void descended further, now hovering just above the clearing. I could feel its presence pressing downward, filling the space around me, stretching into the dunes. I wanted to leave. I wanted to run across the sand, away from this patch of night that did not belong. But my feet would not move. I was rooted, held by some quiet gravity in the air. I watched the stars flicker around the edges of the blackness. It swallowed their light, yet it did not reflect or absorb. It existed as a separate thing, independent, patient. I pressed my palms to my knees, my chest tightening. A faint hum rose from beneath the dunes, not loud but insistent, echoing in rhythm with my heartbeat. And the darkness above, it pulsed subtly with it. I imagined stepping into it. Would it consume me? Would I vanish like the sand figures, the footprints, the silent caravan? Or would it wait patiently, stretching across the night, holding me in place until I understood its purpose? I blinked, and when I opened my eyes, it had descended just a little more. I stayed where I was. My shadow stretched toward the void, thin and trembling. I felt my own breathing echo in the silence of the desert. Time became meaningless. Minutes, hours, or seconds, none seemed to matter. Only the blackness hovering above the clearing, the faint hum beneath my feet, the stretching of shadows that did not belong. Finally, I sank to sand, pressing my forehead to my knees. The void remained. It waited, silent, patient, enormous. I could feel the desert holding me in place, holding the clearing, the dunes, the night itself, and I could not move. When dawn came, soft and hesitant, the black shape was gone. The stars returned, ordinary and bright. The desert seemed empty once more, but I knew it would return, night after night, slowly, descending, patient, waiting to hover just above the sand. A darkness that did not belong, and I would see it again, and I would feel its weight pressing quietly against the night, because some things in the desert do not move like we do. They wait, and the night bends around them. The desert wind had always been my companion. It brushed across the dunes, soft and dry, carrying dust and the faint scent of cracked stone. But that night, it carried something else. Whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind itself, sighing through the hollows. But the voices were faint, human, repeating fragments of names, broken syllables, half-heard, curling around the dunes. I stepped out of my tent, listening. The whispers moved with me. I walked north. The same whispers followed. I walked south. They followed there too. I stopped. The air felt thick, holding its breath. The sand beneath my feet shifted faintly, as if warning me to move slowly. I tried to understand. Each fragment of a name carried weight, memory, longing. They were not loud, not demanding, just present. I followed them. Curiosity pressed me forward, even as dread crept along my spine, across dunes, over soft hollows, toward a clearing I recognized from days before. The whispers grew slightly louder here, but the clearing was empty. Sand stretched plain and smooth beneath the moonlight. No footprints, no figure, just a faint vibration in the air, like the desert itself was alive. I stopped again. The voices twisted around me, familiar yet impossible, calling names I could not place, names I thought belonged to someone else. I knelt in the sand. The grain sifted softly through my fingers. The whispers pressed closer, curling into the hollows, echoing faintly in the dune shadows. Every direction I looked, the sound came back to the same spot. I swallowed. The wind stirred my hair, brushing my cheeks with chill, and the whispers, repeating, circling, unending, led me back to the center of the empty clearing. I pressed my palms to the sand, feeling it cool beneath me. It was ordinary, yet I could feel the presence beneath. The low hum, subtle, insistent, vibrating under the grains. I whispered, soft, careful, half expecting an answer. Nothing came, only the desert holding itself still, and the wind, carrying fragments of names, fragile, broken, echoing across the dunes. I imagined following the sound into the night, chasing it through hollows and ridges, over the dunes, endlessly. And yet, every path returned me here, to this clearing, empty, silent, except for the faint murmuring in the wind. I felt the desert around me tighten, subtle, patient. The wind pressed against my skin. It carried the faint scent of dry roots, of sand disturbed long ago, and beneath it all that low, impossible vibration. I lay back on the sand, staring up at the moon. The whispers wove through the dunes, curling around rocks, brushing against hollows, never leaving the same place twice, always leading back, always returning to this empty clearing. I felt my heartbeat slow, careful, trying to sync with the desert's rhythm. But the whispers, they did not match. They were older, patient, eternal, not asking for attention, only present. The wind shifted, a faint sigh passing over the dunes. The voices softened, almost silent, a gentle echo fading into the night. I pressed my hand against my chest. The emptiness of the clearing pressed against me, and I realized the desert itself held the voices, a memory woven into the sand, carried by wind, repeating in fragments that no one could ever piece together. I rose slowly. The whispers had faded, almost gone, but I could feel them lingering, faint, patient. The desert held them still, waiting for someone else to follow, to hear. I looked back once. The clearing was empty, smooth sand under the moonlight, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. Yet I knew the whispers would return, every night, carried on the wind, circling, patient, leading back to the same empty place. And I had been drawn here, pulled by the desert's quiet, insistent memory, the voices in the wind, whispering. The desert dawn was soft, pale gold spilling across the dunes. I walked toward the far edge of the cactus field, where jagged saguaros stretched their arms to the sky. The air smelled of dry earth, of cracked sand, and faint resin from the cacti. And then I saw it, a shadow, leaning against a tall saguaro, still, almost casual. It didn't move as I approached, didn't breathe, just waited. I stopped, my boots pressing lightly into the sand. The figure was impossibly thin, its outline dark against the morning light, its head tilted slightly. And for a long moment, I thought it might vanish if I blinked. I didn't blink. I kept my gaze steady. The desert air held me in place. Every rustle of wind, every subtle movement of sand, echoed too loudly in my chest. I took a slow step forward. Nothing. The figure remained. Rigid, patient. I wanted to call out. The sound caught in my throat, strangled by fear and awe. The desert seemed to fold around us, silent except for the faint hum under the sand. The sun rose higher, spilling light across the field. And then it was gone. The figure had vanished. No trace of footprints. No shadow lingering along the sand. The saguaro stood alone. But I noticed deep grooves carved into its skin. I knelt to touch the cactus. The grooves were fresh, jagged, deliberate. The resin oozed faintly, sticky against my fingers. I could feel the imprint of something not human, something long, deliberate, pressing against the cactus. A shiver ran down my spine. The desert was ordinary again. The wind returned to its soft sigh. But I knew the figure had been here, watching, waiting. I imagined at night, returning silently to the cactus line, leaning against the tall saguaro, waiting for the first light to find it, its shadow stretching impossibly, bending around the other cacti, the sand beneath its feet untouched, smooth, patient. I took a step back, the coarse sand crunching softly under my boots, the smell of dry resin mixed with dust and heat from the morning sun. The grooves in the cactus reminded me that it had been close, impossibly close, yet completely intangible. I pressed my palm to my chest. The desert wind brushed my hair, soft, insistent, and I felt it, the presence lingering. Not far, not gone, just waiting beyond sight. I wanted to leave, but something held me. Curiosity, fear, a quiet need to see if it would return. I circled the cactus, careful not to touch the grooves. The sand beneath me shifted faintly with every step. The desert felt alive, patient, holding its breath. I glanced across the field. Saguaros stretched in lines, shadows long in the morning sun. Nothing moved, nothing breathed, and yet I felt the figure's eyes on me. Not human eyes. Something older, patient, endless. I knelt again, tracing the grooves lightly with my fingers. The resin smelled faintly metallic, like iron and blood. The desert's hum beneath the sand pulsed softly. I imagined the figure returning each night, leaning against a cactus, waiting for someone to see. The air shifted. A faint breeze carried sand across my legs. The sun climbed higher, and still the figure remained absent. But I could feel it, in the grooves of the cactus, in the vibrations under the sand, in the weight of the desert pressing quietly around me. I stood, brushing sand from my hands. The cactus field stretched endless, ordinary, silent. Yet I knew the figure would return, and I would see it again, at dusk, when shadows stretched impossibly long, when the desert held its breath, when the saguaro groves whispered in resin and wind, and I would be there, watching, waiting, like the desert itself. Night fell slowly over the desert, soft and quiet. The air was cool against my skin, carrying the faint scent of dry stone and dust. I walked across the dunes barefoot, feeling the sand shift under my feet. And then I noticed it. The ground moved, not with wind, not with my steps. The sand itself rippled like water, faint undulations glowing in the pale moonlight. I knelt to touch it. The grains pressed upward against my palm. Soft, deliberate, almost as if something beneath was pushing, testing the surface. A faint vibration ran through the soles of my feet, slow and steady. I imagined shapes forming. Fingers of sand stretching upward, then broader, taller forms pressing against the surface. Something unseen, alive beneath the dunes. I pressed my hand deeper into the sand. It trembled slightly, and I felt it presence, silent, patient, watching. The desert wind sighed faintly through the hollows. A subtle rustle across the dunes. Not from the air, not from any creature I could see, just sand. I stayed in one spot for long moments, breathing shallowly. The sand rippled in slow waves beneath me, almost like it had a memory, a rhythm I couldn't name. I wanted to move, to run, but curiosity held me in place, heavy and patient. I imagined the shapes beneath the dunes pushing higher, rising slowly, impossibly, trying to escape the earth. The moonlight cast pale reflections over their unseen forms. Shadows twisted in the dunes, curling unnaturally toward the hollows. I whispered, soft, careful. No response. The desert held its breath, vibrating faintly under the grains. I thought of the figures I had seen before. The sand shapes, the silent caravan, the watchers on a ridge. All patient, all deliberate. And now this, the desert itself alive, moving beneath my hands, beneath my feet. I stepped slowly backward. The sand rippled in gentle waves where I had pressed. I imagined something following, shifting, waiting just beneath the surface. Something unseen, patient, and aware. I knelt again, letting my fingers sink into the moving sand. It pressed upward faintly, testing. A pulse, almost imperceptible. I felt in my fingertips, along my arms, threading through my chest. The desert wind shifted, brushing my hair. It carried a faint scent of dry roots, of hidden hollows, of earth disturbed long ago. And beneath it all, the sand moved, slowly, deliberately. I imagined rising shapes, taller than any man, pressing through the dunes, silent, unseen, their edges blurred, shifting like water. And I realized the desert itself was not still. It never had been. I pressed my palms to my knees, grounding myself. The sand beneath vibrated faintly, insistent, patient. A quiet rhythm, slow, deliberate. And the shapes beneath, they waited. I rose, brushing sand from my hands and knees. The dunes stretched smooth and silver under the moonlight. No forms visible. No footprints. Nothing to suggest life. Yet I could feel it. The subtle pressure under the surface. The gentle push of something unseen. A presence that followed my gaze, patient, persistent. I walked across the dunes slowly. The sand shifted beneath my feet in subtle waves. I imagined reaching out and feeling the shapes push against my legs. But I did not. I only watched, feeling the slow, quiet rhythm of the desert beneath me. By dawn, the dunes were ordinary again. Soft light spilled across the sand. The ripples had smoothed. No sign remained of movement. But I knew the shapes waited. Beneath the sand, patient, silent, alive. And when night returned, they would move again, rising faintly, pushing to the desert floor, testing, watching, patient. And I would be there, observing, unable to stop them. The desert never sleeps. And neither do the shapes beneath its sand. The desert highway stretched endlessly under the fading light. I had walked for hours, following the soft curve of asphalt swallowed by sand. And there it was, a figure, standing beside an old memorial cross. No one else in sight, the sand around the cross untouched. I slowed. My boots crunched faintly on the gravel. The figure remained, silent, unmoving, its outline dark against the twilight sky. I stepped closer. Headlights from a distant car washed over it briefly. And then, nothing, the figure vanished. Only the cross remained, flowers fresh, bright against the worn wood. I knelt, brushing sand from the base. No footprints led to it. No one could have been here. The wind stirred softly, carrying the faint metallic scent of dust and iron. I imagined the figure moving along the highway, always just beyond sight, watching, waiting. I whispered the names of travelers long gone. The desert swallowed them. The cross remained. And I felt a subtle, patient weight pressing from the edge of my vision. I walked along the roadside, careful, slow. The figure did not reappear, but I could feel it, lingering in the spaces between dunes. Its presence quiet, insistent. I stayed near the cross until the last light faded. The desert night pressed close, and I realized the flowers had not wilted. Someone, or something, was tending them, and I was utterly alone. A shallow cave opened against the base of a dune. Its mouth was small, unremarkable, framed by jagged stone. But the darkness inside, it drew me. I stepped closer. The air smelled of damp earth, cool and heavy against the dry desert night. My fingers brushed the stone walls. Cold, rough, silent. I entered slowly. Shadows clung to walls, thicker than the night outside. Every movement of my hand cast shapes that did not quite match reality. I thought I saw something shift. A shadow just beyond sight. Something alive, or pretending to be. I froze, listening to the faint hum in the cave. It was a vibration beneath the sand, beneath the stone. Soft, almost like breathing. I moved forward, careful. Every step echoed quietly, swallowed immediately by the darkness. The shadows stretched, flickered, and pulsed against the walls. I imagined hands reaching from the stone, from the black beyond. A weight pressed against my chest, subtle, patient. And then nothing. I knelt in the cool sand, pressing my palm to the floor. The hum persisted, faint, unrelenting, movement beyond vision, testing the edges of my perception. I rose slowly. The cave seemed endless, impossibly deep. And when I stepped back into the moonlight, the desert felt ordinary again. But the memory lingered. Shadows that clung, a dark alive beneath the stone, patient, waiting. I woke to find a circle of stones in the sand. Not there the night before. Perfectly round. Each stone smooth, cold under my fingers. I stepped inside. Immediately, the desert fell silent. No wind, no rustle of sand, no faint hum beneath the dunes. Only the faint feeling of breath on my neck. I looked around. Shadows bent toward the circle, stretching unnaturally across the sand. The stones pressed a rhythm against my mind. Slow, patient, deliberate. I tried to step out. My legs felt heavy. The circle held me. I whispered, careful, soft. No response. And yet, I felt eyes. Not human, not visible. Watching. Waiting. The desert outside continued as usual. But inside the circle, time felt thinner, stretched. A low vibration beneath my feet pulsed faintly, echoing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I pressed my palms against the sand. The stone seemed to hum subtly. And then I realized leaving was not enough. The circle had marked me. Patient. Waiting. I finally stepped out. The desert air returned. Ordinary. The hum faded. But the memory remained. A weight pressing quietly against my spine. A whisper of patience I could not shake. One night, the moon never rose. The sky remained black, unbroken, endless. Stars burned faintly against the darkness, but the light I depended on vanished. I walked across the dunes. The desert stretched ordinary and silent, yet figures moved. Shadows made of starlight wandered the clearing, not solid, not tangible, just glimpses, flickers, bending around the dunes and rocks. I tried to step closer. They receded, stretching away, patient, impossible. No footprints, no sound. The desert held its breath. I knelt in the sand. The air smelled of ozone, faint, metallic, like distant lightning. My fingers pressed into sand, cold, dry, alive beneath my touch. The starlight figures hovered, circling, patient, watching, waiting. I whispered softly. No response. Only the faint brush of wind carrying starlight through the dunes. I stayed until the first hint of dawn. The stars faded. The figures vanished. The desert returned to ordinary, ordinary light. But I knew they would return, night after night, when the moon disappeared, when the starlight bent in impossible ways. And I would be here to watch. I woke to see it, a tall, thin silhouette pressed against my tent wall. No noise, no movement beyond the faint outline, shifting slightly in the wind. I froze. The shadow did not resemble me. It did not match anything I had seen. It only leaned there. I unzipped the flap quickly. Nothing. The sand outside smooth. No trace of presence. I pressed my hand against the wall where the shadow had been. The fabric felt ordinary, thin and warm from the sun earlier, yet my chest tightened. I watched the tent through the pale moonlight. The shadow returned, stretching impossibly tall, bending toward the dunes. Slow, patient, watching. I whispered, careful, soft. No reply, only the desert's faint hum beneath the sand. I tried to sleep. The wind carried faint rustling across the dunes. The shadow pressed into memory, patient, indifferent. I felt in the tent, in the grains beneath my mattress, lingering at the edges of vision. By dawn, it was gone. No trace remained. The desert stretched ordinary and pale. Yet I knew the shadow would return. Night after night, patient, impossible. Waiting for the moon to dip, for the desert to breathe. And I would remain awake. A cracked stone well sat half buried in the sand. Its edges were worn smooth by time and wind. I knelt beside it, brushing the sand away. A faint hum rose from its depths. Not loud, not insistent. Just patient, as if the well itself was breathing. I dropped the stone into it. No sound. The echo never came. Only the faint vibration beneath the sand, pulsing softly under my hands. I peered inside. Shadows flickered just beyond sight, movements too subtle to name, like something alive, patient, waiting. I pressed my palm against the rim. The stone felt cool, ordinary, but I could feel a pull, gentle, insistent, as if the desert itself wanted me to lean closer. I whispered into the opening. No reply, only the hum, quiet and endless. The air smelled faintly metallic. Dust and dryness mixed with a hint of something older, a memory pressed into the stones. And I felt it, weight, presence, patient hidden beneath the sand. I stepped back. The dunes stretched ordinary and pale, but the hum remained in my chest, in my fingertips, a pulse beneath the desert that I could not shake. I knew I would return, to the well, to the hum, to the shadows waiting quietly, because some things in the desert do not end. They wait. Night fell, soft and cool, and I heard them, voices distant, carrying melodies across the dunes, old campfire songs. No one else was near, no tents, no travelers, no flicker of fire, only the music, faint, carrying through the desert air. I rose, walking toward the sound. The sand shifted softly beneath my feet. The songs wrapped around the dunes, curling through hollows, bending toward me. I whispered along, careful, soft. The voices harmonized, floating across the sand. Not human, not fully, yet familiar, like memories I could almost place. I knelt, pressing my fingers into the dunes. The sand trembled faintly. The desert hummed along with the songs, low and patient. And I realized the melodies were not meant for me. They were memories, echoes, carried endlessly in the wind. I stayed until the moon dipped low. The songs faded slowly. The desert returned to silence. But I could feel them lingering in the air, patient, waiting for someone else to hear. I woke to find it again. A shadow taller than any tree, passing through the clearing. The sand beneath it grew cold. The fire burned low, flames trembling as though in fear. I froze. The shadow stretched impossibly long, bending over dunes, curling around rocks. Not human, not natural. It moved silently, patient, deliberate. I whispered its name, unsure why. No reply, only the faint vibration beneath my feet, subtle and insistent. I pressed my hands to my knees, leaning closer to the fire. The shadows twisted around me. The desert held its breath. The tall shape passed, indifferent, pressing the sand with impossible weight. I could feel its presence long after it left the clearing. Cold, patient, watching. The fire burned lower. The night stretched quiet and endless. I knew it would return, night after night, silent, bending the desert to its will, and I would remain waiting, unable to move. A shard of glass lay half buried in the sand. I found it while walking across a dune, pale and smooth, glinting in the moonlight. I looked through it. The desert transformed. Shapes appeared beyond normal sight. Figures watching from just beyond the dunes. Motionless, patient, silent, I held the glass closer. Each grain of sand seemed sharper, each shadow deeper. The figures did not move, yet I felt their awareness, waiting. I knelt, pressing the glass to the sand. The sand beneath vibrated faintly, subtle, insistent. The desert breathed around me, alive, patient. I looked up. The normal desert stretched pale under the moonlight. Yet through the glass I saw them, watching, waiting. I whispered soft, careful words. No reply, only the desert's faint hum beneath the sand. The glass trembled slightly in my hands. I felt it pull, subtle, patient. I rose, brushing sand from my hands. The shard remained, glinting faintly in the moonlight, and I knew I could never leave it behind. The figures would wait for me, patient, silent. Night fell. The dunes stretched silver and pale. I sat on a small ridge, listening. A faint ringing. A bell. Distant. Impossible. No caravan had passed this road in decades. No sound of hooves. No creak of wheels. Only the bell, carried across the desert, patient, faint. I rose, walking toward the sound. The sand shifted softly beneath my feet. The bell's rhythm pulsed faintly in time with my heartbeat. I paused at the edge of a hollow. Nothing visible, only the ringing, soft, deliberate, echoing across the dunes. I whispered into the night, careful, soft. No reply. The bell continued, patient, steady, indifferent. I pressed my hand to the sand. It trembled faintly, a vibration beneath my palm, low, insistent. The desert itself seemed alive, echoing the bell. I stayed until the moon dipped low. The sound faded slowly, but I could feel it lingering in the dunes, patient, waiting. And I knew it would return, night after night. The bell, the desert, the unseen caravan. And I would remain listening. I had left a folding chair near the fire. Ordinary, small, empty. But when I returned at dusk, it was rocking, slowly, gently, as if someone invisible had sat there. The sand beneath it shifted softly, faint ridges forming and disappearing. No footprints, no wind, only the chair moving, patient, deliberate. I knelt to touch it. The metal frame hummed faintly under my fingertips, warm from the sun earlier, yet now cold, strange, alive. I whispered softly, careful. No reply, only the faint vibration beneath my hands, threading into my chest. I stepped back, watching. The chair continued its gentle rhythm. The firelight cast long, trembling shadows, and I could feel the presence beside it, patient, unseen. I sat on the sand, unable to look away. The desert held its breath. The chair rocked. The sand shifted beneath it. I realized the invisible watcher was patient, not cruel, not hurried, just observing. Night deepened. I stayed until the fire burned low. The chair never stopped, and I knew it would return, night after night. Patient, silent. I noticed it first at dusk. Thick smoke, rising far across the desert. A dark column, twisting, curling toward the sky. By morning, nothing burned. No fire, no wreckage, only the lingering smell of ash in the air. I walked toward the horizon. The dunes stretched silver beneath my boots. The air carried a faint metallic tang, like iron and blood. I pressed my hand to the sand. A low vibration ran beneath my fingertips. Patient, indifferent. The smoke had left no trace. Yet I could feel in the dunes and the hollows, in the weight of the desert itself, a presence unseen. Patient, waiting. I whispered softly. No answer, only the faint hiss of wind and the lingering smell of ash. The dunes stretched endless. The horizon remained ordinary. Yet I knew the black smoke would return, and I would remain waiting, patient. Half buried in a dune, I found a leather-bound journal. The sand clung to its edges, soft and dry. I opened it carefully. Inside, faded words described travelers who vanished in the desert. The handwriting wavered, trembling with fear or perhaps exhaustion. The last entry read, "Do not follow the shadows." I pressed the journal to my chest. The desert around me seemed heavier, patient. I could feel the sand beneath shifting faintly, as if responding. I imagined the shadows the journal warned about, tall, patient, moving silently across the dunes, waiting for someone to follow. I whispered the words aloud. The wind carried them softly. No reply, only the faint vibration beneath my feet. I closed the journal. The dunes stretched ordinary. Yet I knew the desert remembered every traveler, every story, every warning, and I had become part of its memory. Night fell, thick and silent. I heard it then, a knock, from the empty metal water tank near my camp. 3 times, patient, deliberate, waiting for an answer. I stepped closer. The sand shifted faintly beneath my boots. I whispered softly, careful. No reply. The knock repeated. 3 slow beats. The tank seemed alive. A low vibration ran through the metal into my chest. I pressed my hand against the cool surface. It trembled faintly, in rhythm with the knocks. Silent communication. A presence. Patient. Waiting. I stepped back, breathing shallowly. The desert held its breath with me. The knocks faded slowly. But I knew they would return. Every night, 3 slow beats. Patient. Insistent. And I would remain listening. Dawn broke quietly. The desert stretched pale and endless. The dunes glowed faintly in soft morning light. And then I saw it, a shadow, alone, stretching impossibly long across the clearing. It did not match any living figure. It did not bend or falter or move like anything I had ever seen. I watched. The desert held its breath. The sand beneath it trembled faintly, shifting with impossible weight. I stepped closer. The shadow remained indifferent, patient. I pressed my palm to sand. Vibration ran up my arm. Cold, alive. I whispered softly. No answer, only the faint hum beneath the dunes. The sun rose higher. The shadow did not shrink. It did not move. It only stretched, reaching across the desert, a final presence before the ordinary day returned. I realized the shadow was the desert itself, patient, eternal, a witness to everything that had passed. I turned slowly, walking away. The dunes glowed silver beneath the sun, but I could feel the shadow stretching behind me, waiting, alone, endless, and I understood at last. Some things are not meant to be followed, not meant to be understood, only witnessed and remembered.